The first indication that this collection is something special is when you walk up to the front door and enter and see not only just the cars, but the aura of an era that's long gone.
The founding member, Paul, you've got a person that was collecting cars before World War II. I mean, those are the people that started this as a hobby.
Paul Kelsey was a man in the early 1900s, an entrepreneur looking for any way he could support his family. Cars, as the story goes, was part of his passion growing up with his dad, and he wanted to continue that with his son along the way.
Paul Kelsey, at a very early age, decided that cars that he remembered from his past and cars that he owned, he wanted to keep them, and he wanted to chronicle those cars and let people know about some of these cars, some commonplace, some obscure, and began literally a lifelong of automobile collecting. So the collection began up in Minnesota, and Paul had an idea that he maybe wanted to head someplace where maybe there might be an audience, a leisure destination for his growing collection.
The Ozark Mountains in Missouri, land of good old mountain music.
He ran across Camdenton, Missouri, and just absolutely fell in love with the area and decided that's where he was going to move his family and his collection.
He decided to open his own museum with his son in order to give back to the community and start sharing some of this car knowledge that they both had. His son growing up also loved cars, so it was a father-son mission.
When I was a boy, when we'd go on family vacations, my dad would always take us to a car museum. So I know I was at the museum in probably 1965-ish.
The collection spans from the late 1800s all the way to the mid-1970s. So they have a little bit of everything they've collected over their lifetimes that they thought was neat. Makes and models I never even heard of back in the early 1900s, that companies were just being excited and trying to produce cars that they thought would live a long life and didn't make it back then. So seeing some of this stuff is purely history and decades of automobiles.
When the Kelsey Museum find is offered and sold in Dallas, there's approximately 70 cars. There's a handful of cars that are total projects. And then there's, you start as early as 1899. There's a 1902 Pierce that I think is the oldest Pierce in existence. There's an enclosed Franklin. Early enclosed cars are practically impossible to find. And then there's some muscle cars from the 60s.
One of the stars of the collection is a 1933 Auburn.
Super rare. Only 14 were built. Now keep in mind, Auburn got caught up like everybody did in the Depression era. Formed in the early 1900s. By the late 1930s, the company was out of business. But boy, they sure produced some automobiles. This has got a potent 160 horsepower, 12-cylinder engine. It's a 3-speed manual transmission. And it's been owned by the family for 58 years.
We've researched that car enough to learn that we've got history and ownership going all the way back to 1936. So to have that kind of documentation or insight on the car, a car that's been around for all this time, and know where it's been, is tremendous for the next person in their collection.
There's the 1914 Stutz Bearcat, which is considered by Stutz aficionados to be the holy grail Stutz.
The 4E model, E meaning a lot of technology, an electric starter and electric lights. Keep in mind, this was an early time period for automobiles, and conveniences we take for granted today weren't back then. And what really makes the Bearcat so special and so desirable was the performance that these cars actually had for the time period. They were considered a sports car, a performance car, maybe even a muscle car of that era.
And it is by far, quite possibly, worth as much as all the other cars in the collection.
Paul and John Kelsey working together to manage this collection of cars is going to be a huge benefit to all of us in the collector car community.
What Mecum has decided to do is keep these cars basically untouched, like Paul and John have done over the past almost 100 years. We are taking extreme caution even moving these cars, so the next person gets to claim the rights of if they want to keep it original or they want to restore it for their personal collection or a museum. So we've captured the essence of their vision of what would happen to these cars.
There's cars that are once in a lifetime cars, but more than that, it's a once in a lifetime experience when you say that. I think the best word is to call it a museum find.
I haven't seen anything like this in the past 10 years, at minimum, of where you're able to get something that no one's been into in those decades of cars.
I have called it a treasure chest, and I really do mean that. I think that this is a real opportunity for folks to get cars that really exude a personality of originality, which, as time goes on, becomes more and more important, more and more popular with collectors.